Hi, my name is Alex, and today we will be going over slow flight. Um, this is a maneuver that could either be for a commercial or a private applicant, probably more so relevant to the private applicant since it'll be the first time that they've seen this. Um, First off, the goal for a slow flight maneuver is to operate the aircraft at a speed that is just below the critical angle of attack and just above the stall speed, right? So, how we usually accomplish this is by high lift devices, also known as flaps, and fully we'll reduce power. We'll input the flaps, and those are the two devices that we will use in order to allow us to achieve this state of the slowest possible airspeed for flight, right? For a sustained straight and level flight. But first, in order to completely understand what or how we can perform slow flight, we will need to first review over the four fundamentals of flight. And straight and level flight specifically, we'll start with. So in flight, I'll draw my little airplane. I'm not the greatest artist, so I apologize for whoever's watching. I'll actually just use the camber of a wing. For flight, how we stay in the air, right, is we have lift, which is created by the shape of this airfoil and the differentials of pressure, right? We have a high pressure here, low pressure here. That is a discussion for another day, but that's just a quick review of how we stay in the air. So for a plane, for the four forces acting on it, so we have that lift that is generated by the wing, right? So we have lift, which is what keeps us in the air. We have lift, right? And then we have the weight of gravity, the gravitational force. So we're just going to say in G, which is again like 1G, 2G is our gravitational forces, or G's, G forces as we know them. Where we have our lift, we have our force of gravity. We have our thrust that is generated by the engine, right? We have our thrust. And then we'll have our drag, which is the forces that are enacted, or the horizontal forces enacted on the aircraft by our thrust. It's the force that is opposed to our thrust. So in straight and level flight, these forces should all equal each other, right? Our lift should equal our gravitational force, so they should be directly proportional. Our thrust should equal our drag, and that will allow us to sustain straight and level flight. And when we climb and when we descend, these forces will change. When we climb, we'll increase our angle of attack, right, which will not quite that steep. We'll increase our angle of attack by, 10 degrees or so, depending on what we're doing, climbing, descending. Let's say this is straight, 10 degrees. That's the difference right there. And that will increase our lift because it will increase the surface area of the higher pressure air that's generated beneath the wing, right? So this angle of attack gives us a greater surface area for more of that high pressure air to be able to under the wing, and then it will lift us up and cause us to climb, right? And these forces will stay relatively the same, right? And this gravitational force, when we're in this, so it'll be lift is here, right? Lift will keep us in the air. This gravitational force will always be pointing towards the ground. It is not directly opposed to the lift. It's towards the ground. Our gravitational force will always keep us towards the ground. We'll have our thrust, and we'll have our drag. And we'll still have those forces acting upon our wing and our airfoil. So those are the forces that act in flight. And then the same is true with descents. We will shallow our bank and we'll descend and we'll decrease our thrust, right? So we'll decrease our thrust, which will then cause us to have a descent, right? So all those things happen. So those are climbs, descents, level turns, same thing. Again, these are probably be more thoroughly analyzed in our lesson of aerodynamics. But in turns, how this is applied is we trade this vertical component of lift for a horizontal component of lift. So for an aircraft, when we have a vertical component of lift and we turn, we'll exchange it for a horizontal component of lift, right? So for whatever we lose in our lift in a turn, right? So let's say we lose this segment here, we'll gain that segment here, right? In our horizontal component of lift. So in a turn, this is this affects how we maneuver, right? So in slow flight, these are all very, very important because we need to get to a point where our angle of attack right here is just enough where we stay in the air, but then we reduce our thrust and our power setting to not climb, but to stay in the air, and we will use flaps to, again, make for a higher lift device, right? So at lower air speeds, we can maintain that same amount of lift, right? And so when we lose our thrust, right, we descend. So we need to add these high lift devices known as flaps in order to maintain our straight and level flight, but just at a slower airspeed, right? So how we accomplish this, right, is in the Archer specifically, this is different from aircraft to aircraft, but in Archer specifically, the stall speed is usually dependent on the day, around 40 to 45 knots. And for a commercial applicant, we want to stay roughly 5 knots above that speed. So around 45 to 50 knots is we want to reduce our power. Usually in the TCO at Purdue, it says reduce power to 1500 RPM. That is not a hard and fast rule. That is just a ballpark estimate of a reduced power setting that will bleed off of that airspeed as we maintain that back pressure to compensate for the loss in thrust and the loss in power to maintain our cruise setting, right? So as we let off that power, we'll maintain that back pressure, which will cause our angle of attack to slightly lift up. And then once we have the angle of attack, we can trim it out, right? And that is something that is not necessarily used enough in general aviation, I believe. It is something that allows us to not have to fight that back pressure the entire time, but to lock it in with our trim setting. So once we find that spot, and we'll go in slow flight all the way up to the first indication of a stall, whether that be the buffet of the plane starting to rattle, or that be the stall horn or the stall warning identification system. In our G1000, it's an actual audible voice. In other steam gauge aircraft that I got my private in, there was a horn that would buzz every time we get right up to that stall. Right, so when you get right up to that stall horn, it's the first indication of the stall, that or the buffet, whichever comes first. And when we get to that point, we'll add power. We'll still maintain that altitude, but we want to stay right above that stall warning horn and right under that critical angle of attack, right? Which is indicated by the stall warning horn. So once we get to that spot, we'll hold that back pressure so we're not losing altitude, and we'll incrementally add power to the point where we can maintain that airspeed of around, in the Archer, 45 to 50 knots, and that altitude that we have locked in. We'll trim that out. And in slow flight, the purpose of this is, there might be surveillance pilot in the future, or surveillance pilots now, or potentially a pilot who learns this, who in the future will use to survey, to go at low airspeeds. Whenever you need to accomplish low airspeeds while maintaining an altitude, you will use slow flight. You'll use these flaps. You'll maintain the back pressure on the yoke at a low airspeed in a low engine RPM setting, lower relatively speaking. And then slow flight, something that is not necessarily indicated in the lesson plan that I have today, but in slow flight, maybe in terms of the ACS, they might ask you to make a turn, and you should not make a turn greater than 10 degrees. And the movements in slow flight should be very, very small. For the reason of, we talked earlier about the aerodynamics of a turn, right? And when you turn, right, you lose a component of the vertical component of lift, and you exchange it for the horizontal component of lift. So if we turn and we're already at a very, very slow airspeed, and we're maximizing the amount of lift at our given power setting, we don't want to aggressively exchange that, right? Because then we'll stall, and in a turn, we'll potentially spin out of the air, which is a condition that is obviously not ideal. So in our turns, we want to make them slow, gradual, steady, no more than 10 degrees of bank, because again, we don't want to lose too much of that lift component in slow flight. And then to recover, we'll obviously full power, incrementally put the flaps down, and relieve that back pressure, right? And then continue on straight and level. So for the procedure specifically, we kind of already walked through it, but I want to talk about it more in terms of the actual procedure, right? So we're going to reduce the power, and again, the Archer 1500 RPM is the power we want to reduce it to. Typically was what the TCO indicates, right? So we reduce the power setting to a specified airspeed, and then remember, as we're doing that, we're increasing the back pressure to maintain that altitude. And then we'll also want to make sure we have right rudder for the left turning tendencies, because as we slow down, we increase our induced drag, which then again, as the propeller rotates to the right, it gives us a left turning tendency, which is increased with a lower power setting. So we want to make sure we have that right rudder in to maintain that coordination between the airfoils. So maintain that right rudder, incrementally add flaps, so one at a time as we get slower and slower in airspeed, maintaining that back pressure, trimming it out if necessary, maintaining that right rudder, and then we maintain that back pressure until, again, the first indication of the stall. So right below the critical angle of attack and the stall speed specifically for that aircraft. And given the day, that can change based on the performance. At hotter, more humid days, you're going to have worse performance, and on cooler, colder days, we're going to have a greater performance. So depending on the days, those specific numbers can change, and how we get there can change as well. Remember, trim it, locking it in, we're trimming it, and then maintain level flight, or turn and climb as desired. And then we've already gone over the recovery. And then the cues. Remember, the buffet is a cue that we use. Keeping the nose level with the horizon is another cue to make sure we're staying straight and level, even though we don't want to maintain too much back pressure, because we get too much back pressure, our nose will get above the horizon, and we do not want to do that, because we'll obviously lose too much, or we'll exceed our critical angle of attack, and we'll go into a stall, which is not the desired outcome of slow flight. Slow flight is not designed to initiate a stall. Slow flight is designed to maintain flight at the slowest possible airspeed. Again, 5 to 10 knots above that stall speed. And the completion standards for a private applicant, we want to so no one can perfectly maneuver. I myself am not capable of a perfect maneuver. We are all have room for improvement. So for a private applicant, they want to keep, the goal will be for the ACS standards. Now again, this isn't a standard we want to live by, but it's a measure that we can measure ourselves against, right? So we want to maintain plus or minus 100 feet, airspeed plus 10 knots minus 0 knots. We do not want to get below that stall speed, right? Heading of plus or minus 10 degrees, so 10 degrees of where we started. And remember, keeping that right rudder to maintain that coordination is going to be necessary with that left turning tendency. And then a bank of 10 degrees. We do not want to exceed that 10 degrees because, again, for the exchange in the horizontal component of lift. Now, commercial, it gets a little more tight. We get a little more tight and strict on our standards. For a commercial applicant, it'll be plus or minus 50 feet with an airspeed of plus or minus plus 5 knots, minus 0 knots. Again, we don't want to go below that critical airspeed because we'll stall below that. But plus 5 is typically the amount we can go over. And a heading of plus or minus 10 degrees, same as the private applicant in a bank of plus or minus 5 degrees. And we want to stay within 5 degrees of our heading. And for the first time we introduce this concept, I want to point out how we're not above the horizon. I want to point out the feeling of the buffet, the stall horn, and how that indicates where our stall speed is, and the first indication of a stall. Those are both important. Also, P factor, torque, and yaw, and how the left turning tendencies affect those as we get slower airspeeds, as that induced drag gets more and more prevalent at slower airspeeds, and how we're going to need to compensate with a lot more right rudder. Errors that we can commonly find in this maneuver is failure to clear the area. So one thing that I should have mentioned at the beginning of those procedures is that we always want to clear the area. We're going to go, we're going to check our area. How I like to do it is you go 90 degrees to the right, you check left, right, clear, left, right, center, clear, no traffic in the area. Go back to your original heading at 90 degrees, left, right, center, clear, no air traffic, and then you can begin your maneuver. That way, we are not in an undesirable configuration with other aircraft in the vicinity. Inadequate back pressure is another thing that I see that I have noticed students struggle with. Not my students, obviously, because I haven't had any. But it's a common error to either use too much of that back pressure or not enough of that back pressure, right? And it's kind of a feel you have to get for it. And you can also obviously have the cues of the horizon, but you don't want to use too much of that back pressure or not enough. But understanding that you get to a point, you hold it, and a way for us to get to the right back pressure is to use trim. Trim is your best friend with maneuvers like this. You don't feel like you have to muscle it the entire time. I remember the first time I used trim in a steep turn, it helped me drastically, and the same can be said about slow flight. When you trim your desired back pressure, that will help you a lot with this common error of not using the back pressure adequately. And then failure to respond to stalling. Stalling, like not being coordinated in a stall, can lead to a spin. So a combination of errors can lead to a configuration that is dangerous. So we need to make sure we're coordinated, and we need to make sure that we're above the stall speed. And that is all I really have. Things that I would include in a discussion with a student would be how to, and I'm just trying to emphasize control and stability and coordination in slow flight, how if we lose one or a few of those elements, that can lead to a catastrophic turn of events. And that's all that I have. And I would go and exhibit this maneuver and show the student the certain sight pictures that we need to be seeing, and walk through the procedure with them. That's all I have. Thank you very much.